Hey guys, so last year when season 1 of the Traitors came out, I ended up making a player ranking for that season, and it ended up becoming the most viewed video on this channel, which I find pretty interesting. But it also became my most controversial video, particularly stemming from my placements of two particular players who I won't spoil here for anyone who hasn't watched season 1. And I still get comments to this day on that video about those placements, which I find pretty interesting. But now here we are a year later doing coverage of season 2 of the Traitors US. And with it airing weekly, that means I can do weekly videos on the Traitors, which I'm looking forward to. And I feel like so far the season has been pretty solid. And obviously now in this video, I'll be doing my power ranking. Now, before I get started, I should acknowledge up front that doing a power ranking like this for a show like the Traitors is very weird for pretty obvious reasons. Obviously, the cast is divided into two groups that have very different characteristics, very different objectives within the game, and obviously different levels of content based on their role on the game. And you also have the fact that the outcome of the game is uncertain, where unlike shows like Survivor or Big Brother, where you know there's going to be one winner at the end, we don't know how many winners there are going to be by the end, or if there are any winners at all, which I find pretty interesting as well. But I'm going to be doing my best to break it all down. But we have 21 players to look at, and let's not waste any more time. Let's get right into the video. So starting off at number 21, we have the first boot of the season, and here we have Johnny Bananas. Now I'm going to admit up front that I've never watched a challenge. I don't really know much about it, but I do know about Bananas and him being one of the bigger names on the cast in my eyes. And yeah, like him being the first boot is kind of crazy, where he was obviously one of the bigger characters and someone that I was expecting to last a little bit longer as a shield, but obviously it wasn't meant to be, as the Traitors wanted to make a big move right off the bat. But beyond that, there isn't too much to really say about Bananas in his run here. And again, it's a shame to lose him this early. But obviously he's now out of the game, which is why he's here at number 21. Now moving on to number 20, and we have the next boot on the board, and here we have Peppermint. And again, losing Peppermint this early is also a bit of a shame here. Now, I do think she doesn't play super well once she's accused of being a traitor, where obviously Trishelle was on her case due to her reaction to a joke she made. Beyond that, like you have her slipping up in a conversation, trying to defend herself. And again, I feel like she was definitely playing on the defense for a lot of it. I don't think she handles it that well. And obviously that leads to her being a pretty early boot, which I do think is a shame here, as I feel like she could have been a very interesting character and definitely an interesting player had she been given more of a chance. But again, she's now out of the game, which is why she's here at number 20. Now moving on to number 19, and we have the next boot on the board, and here we have Marcus. Now again, Marcus didn't get too much to do, where outside of his confessional episode 1, where he talks about being a friendly giant, he doesn't really have too much going on, has a pretty quiet edit outside of that. You also have him coming to the game with his girlfriend, Larsa, which seemed to put a target on his back, and with him seeming to be one of the more intelligent people on the cast, I didn't feel like he had too much of a shot of actually winning the game, but again, it's still a shame to see him go out early. But again, he is now out of the game, which is why he is here at number 19. Now moving on to number 18, we have the most recent boot at the time of recording, and here we have Max. And obviously Max is one of the bigger characters over these first 3 episodes, and definitely one of the bigger players here. Now in terms of him as a player, I don't think he had the worst reads in the world. Like, he was one of the people that didn't believe Peppermint was a traitor, which is pretty good. But beyond that, I feel like he played pretty poorly, where he comes off as pretty sus during the final round. And then obviously he handles himself really terribly during the final round table, where he got into his argument with CT. He tried to deflect by throwing Janelle and Ikensu under the bus. And again, all this just put a massive target on his back that resulted in him being taken out. So again, I'm not saying he's a good player by any means, but obviously he was one of the bigger characters over the course of these first 3 episodes. But again, he is now out of the game, which is why he's here at number 18. And with that, there are 17 players left in the game to talk about, and as usual, I'll be ranking them based on how likely I think they are to win the game based off their edit and current game position. And again, these rankings are going to be really tough to put together, not only because of the things I mentioned earlier, but also the fact that this last episode ended on a cliffhanger, where we're obviously going to get another boot at the beginning of the next episode. And with that, there's a strong risk that my ranking will be immediately outdated by whatever happens at the beginning of that episode. So again, take this all with a grain of salt. But at number 17, the person I believe is the least likely to win from this point is Ikensu. And the reason I have Ikensu at the bottom here is I feel like she's the most likely to be murdered here by Parvati, where obviously she's in the room with the other people, with Parvati having the chalice. And with Janelle and Peter both having shields right now, that really limits the options to one of four people, that being Ekin Sue, MJ, Burgie, or Trishelle. And I feel like of those options, Ekin Sue is the most likely to be murdered because she got a visibility spike in this last episode, where obviously she got into her whole thing with Janelle over the shields in the challenge. She obviously was a focus during the roundtable. And I feel like Parvati could target her as a way of framing Janelle for being a traitor here, which I think would be somewhat interesting here. Now, again, I don't think it's necessarily a guarantee, but I feel like of those options, she's probably the one that I feel the most confident in at the moment to not make it through the night, which is why she's here at number 17. Now moving on to number 16, and we have someone who's probably not going to get murdered tonight. However, I feel like I have no faith in them to actually win the game from this point, and that person is John Burkow. Now, John is someone who I was kind of low on in the preseason. I feel like with him being a very clear outlier in the cast, with him being a politician and him not having much reality TV exposure, I feel like that kind of set him up to either be like a really early boot or someone who is just planned it by production, kind of similar to Scaramucci from Celebrity Big Brother. And obviously he's still in the game, but I feel like he's played pretty terribly up to this point, where obviously he was suspected of being a traitor right at the bat due to his breathing during the initial roundtable meeting. And he's kind of done stuff since then that's kind of furthered suspicion, like him doing well at the challenge, which was a bad look. And even beyond that, he's kind of gotten this dodo edit where I feel like he's not really being taken seriously. He obviously has that moment of him not knowing where the bedrooms are. In general, I feel like he's someone who's not going to be too good at the game at the end of the day. And mixing that in with the fact that he's already being suspected, I feel like it's just not going to go well for John moving forward, which is why he's here at number 16. Now moving on to number 15, and while this person is not being targeted in the same way that John is, I feel like they've also been getting a dodo edit, and here we have Tamra. And I feel like similar to John, I feel like Tamra is being presented as kind of a joke, where in episode 1, she declares pretty confidently that she can smell a phony from a mile away, and that it's going to be really easy for her to figure out who the traitor is. But I feel like the little content we've gotten from her since then has been her being pretty laughably wrong, where in episode 2 during the breakfast, she says that everyone looks guilty. And moving forward, we see her suspecting John of being the traitor, despite him also being presented as a bit of a joke. And again, I feel like Tamara's another one who's not really supposed to be taken seriously, and I feel like outside of her declaration, she's been pretty quiet in the edit. So I feel like because of that, I don't feel confident Tamara's winning either. So because of that, she's here at number 15. Now moving on to number 14, and I'm a bit disappointed by this person's edit up to this point, which is a big reason they are as low as they are, but we actually have CT, also from the challenge. And again, haven't watched the challenge, don't know too much about CT, but I understand he is supposed to be one of the bigger figures on this season, and it's also why I am disappointed by his lack of content up to this point. Now he does have a solid premiere where he does talk about his rivalries from the challenge, like with Bananas and Trishelle, but obviously Bananas goes right away, and he hasn't really interacted with Trishelle too much since the premiere, but obviously that's something we then see in episode 2 after seeing Bananas getting murdered, that he's worried that he's next, which is kind of funny. But beyond that, he doesn't really do too much. And then in episode 3, we just kind of see him in the background for a lot of it, sort of working alongside Dan and Deontay. And then he obviously gets into his argument with Max during the roundtable. But I feel like outside of that, I feel like CT is another one who's been relatively under-edited. He also isn't the best player in the world, where he thought that he was going to be next, and then he admitted that he doesn't know what's going on in the game. Again, I feel like CT is another one who's not meant to be taken seriously, which is a big reason he's here at number 14. Now moving on to number 13, and we have someone who I just mentioned, and here we have Trishelle. And again, another challenge player, don't know much about that, but she has gotten a bigger edit than CT. Now obviously a lot of that is circumstantial, given she has played a pretty massive role in these first 3 episodes, where she was the one really leading the charge to take out Peppermint after her whole conversation with her in episode 1, which has obviously put a pretty big target on her back, considering Peppermint turned out to be faithful, and obviously that's not great. But even beyond that, you have her shown being wrong a couple times, like during the Bananas round, she thought Kevin was the one who was murdered. You also have her in episode 3 talking about wanting to hold back, only to be shown suspecting Dan. And while she doesn't act too much upon this suspicion, it does open it up for her to be targeted by the traitors down the road. And then obviously we have in this last episode her being in the same room as Parvati. And while I said earlier that I think Egan Sue is the most likely to be murdered here, I think Trishelle is probably the next most likely option on the board, as I feel like compared to MJ, taking out Trishelle wouldn't cause as many waves compared to MJ. And I feel like the content of Trishelle suspecting Dan could be a way of justifying the Trishelle murder, as obviously he takes out someone who is onto the traitors at this point. And I feel like with her having a pretty lackluster edit outside of that, I feel like Trishelle's pretty unlikely to win from this point, both from an edit standpoint, but also from a game standpoint. So I feel like for those reasons, I can't have her any higher than number 13. Now moving on to number 12, and we have who I consider the first really big name on the board on this season, and that person is Janelle. And again, I feel like Janelle's probably in a bad spot moving forward. Now, realistically, I didn't think Janelle had too much of a shot coming into it. As well, I don't think she would have been a super early boot. I feel like she would have been kept around as a shield for a bit before eventually being taken out. And I feel like with the way the game is playing out right now, I feel like that could be what's happening here. Where obviously she has been doing pretty well in the challenges, having already gotten 2 shields, and obviously in the most recent episode, it even got her into some trouble with people feeling like she's playing too cutthroat. So I feel like that's not great. And we saw her getting into hot water because of this challenge performance, where we saw Ekin Sue feeling like she shoved her to get a shield, which obviously could paint a target on her back moving forward. And considering the real possibility of Ekin Sue being taken out here by Parvati, I feel like that would be a really terrible blow to Janelle's game, as it would make her look even more suspicious of being a traitor. So I feel like there are already a number of red flags with Janelle's game, both inherently from coming into the season, but also with what we've actually seen in the game up to this point. And while I think she could potentially recover in the future, I feel like with the target she already has on her back, I feel like I can't have her any higher than number 12. Now moving on to number 11, and we have a person who probably has the quietest edit up to this point, and that person is Kevin. And again, Kevin's been extremely quiet in the edit. I believe he's the only person so far that has not gotten a single confessional, which I feel like in general is a pretty bad look for his overall chances in the game. He was obviously considered to be murdered during the first round, and I feel like Kevin seemed to be a likely boot considering he could have been just this random person taken out to create confusion among the faithfuls, but obviously he's spared there. And he really doesn't get more content until episode 3, where he talks about thinking Janelle is a traitor and his whole plan with Peter to create division and casting a vote against each other. Again, just a lot of really random stuff here. And I feel like with Kevin's quiet edit, I feel like it's pretty unlikely he's going to win from this point, which is why he's here at number 11. Now moving on to number 10, and we have someone who I just mentioned, and here we have Peter. And Peter's edit up to this point has been pretty interesting, where he seems to be one of the more active faithfuls in trying to figure out who the traitors are. And I'm sure some people will think he's a contender based off this. However, I think he's probably going to be taken out soon. For straight up, my first instinct after watching the episodes was that Peter was going to be the target based off his content, and it was only after I remembered he had gotten a shield that I backed off of that. But I still feel like he's been undercut at several points that makes me worried about his game moving forward. Where first up, you have his confessional in episode 1 about him not wanting to be the loudest voice and not wanting to put a target on his back, that he wants to listen more than he speaks. But we've literally seen him doing the exact opposite for almost his entire run, where we've seen him talking quite a bit. We've seen him like putting pieces together, and we've even seen people like undercutting him. Like you have in episode 3 where he's at breakfast talking about like what he would do if he was a traitor right next to Dan, and then Dan immediately gets a confessional talking about how Peter's making a mistake by telling all this stuff in front of a traitor. So I feel like that's a pretty bad look. You also have his whole spiel with Kevin about like pretending they're against each other and voting against each other as a way of getting information. And again, that move in general just feels incredibly unnecessary. And while I understand his rationale about how this would make him a bigger target that the traitors would want to keep around, I feel like it just makes it more likely that he'll just be taken out at a round table, where obviously he is a big target by the faithfuls. So I feel like that move is kind of misguided. So while he has been getting a decent amount of content at points, I feel like it's all just going to lead to a downfall at some point. And I feel like he's probably not likely to win because of that. And because of that, he is here at number 10. Now moving on to number 9. And I did consider whether this person is too high. However, this person does have one pro going for them, and that person is MJ. And I feel like MJ's edit has been mostly lackluster until this most recent episode, where I feel like her first two episodes were pretty under edited, which is a pretty bad sign. But again, in the past episode, she has picked up on Dan to a degree, where obviously she is one of the people, along with Larsa, who thinks that Dan is a traitor. And obviously that is good. She has a correct read. And she even calls out Deontay and Sandra for being influential in taking out Max, who was obviously a faithful. And I feel like even with this next murder attempt, while she is in the room and she came very, very close to getting murdered here herself, I mean, I feel like she's probably going to escape through this all right, considering the implications that her death would have on Dan's game. We're considering that she is one of the more vocal people targeting Dan. Obviously, if she were to be taken out, that would just further the suspicion on Dan's back, and Parvati knows this. So I feel like that's something worth considering. But at the end of the day, I still don't consider her a super likely winner, considering how quiet her first two episodes were, which is why she's here at number 9. Now moving on to number 8, and we are finally talking about our first traitor, and here we have Dan Giesling. And obviously Dan is someone I was very excited to see on the cast. He was probably the biggest name for me on this cast. And the fact that he's here playing as a traitor is a very exciting prospect. Now, obviously, the traitors are going to get a lot more content inherently than the faithfuls. And obviously, with Dan being a big name, it kind of makes it hard to assess where he's actually going within the game, as he obviously gets a ton of content here, as you would expect. But if we are looking at where things are going, he kind of has been the main decision maker so far of the traitors, where it seems like he's the one getting his way more often than not in terms of who's going to be targeted. And obviously he's shown being the leader of the traitors group. But obviously one of the bigger knocks to Dan's game is the fact that people are already onto him, namely Larsa and MJ, where we saw in the last episode that they were very much targeting him for him being quiet, which is obviously what you would expect from him. And while he does get lucked out by Max going on his whole spiel during the roundtable, he still gets 2 votes against him, and I feel like MJ and Larsa are unlikely to let up with their Dan suspicions. But at the same time, he also has people on his side, people like Deontay and CT, and I feel like those will navigate him through a lot of the game. So I feel like there's definitely plenty of things going for Dan right now, but at the same time, I am still hesitant about putting him higher on the list, as I feel like he probably will be the first of the traitors to be taken out if it comes down to it. And even beyond that, I could see Parvati and Phaedra growing in the game as they move along to where they eventually supersede Dan as being the leader of the traitors. So I feel like that's another thing going against Dan. So again, I am kind of conflicted about Dan. I feel like he could easily go up or easily go down in the weeks to come. But for now, I do have him here at number 8. Now moving on to number 7, and we are going from one big name to another big name, and here we have Sandra. And while seeing Sandra again isn't as special as seeing Dan again, considering we just saw her a couple of years ago on Australian Survivor, I'm still happy to see Sandra on the season, considering Sandra's a fantastic character. And so far, I feel like she's been playing largely how I expected her to, where while she wanted to be a traitor coming into it, she has been taking the leadership role as a faithful and trying to rally together the votes during each of the roundtables. And obviously she's had a decent amount of influence alongside Deontay, but obviously some people don't like that, where after this last vote, they feel like Sandra and Deontay were responsible for taking out another faithful in Max. But beyond that, I feel like her major storyline in the season is her rivalry with Parvati, where while she plans to stick with Parvati for the time being, she says she wants to target her at the first opportunity. And obviously, while she said this before Parvati was named a traitor, she also reiterated this after Parvati was named a traitor. So I feel like this storyline will come to a head at some point. The question is who wins the battle, and if I had to guess right now, I think Parvati will win the battle. As well, Sandra is kind of on the Parvati. I feel like the show has been propping up Parvati a little bit more, and I feel like with Parvati talking about who the true queen of the traitors is, I feel like it's just going to set up Parvati getting a one-up on Sandra here. Now, obviously, things could change as the season moves along, but I feel like for now, I feel like Sandra's probably being set up to lose this battle against Parvati, which leaves her here at number 7. Now, moving on to number 6, and we have another big name and another traitor, but here we have Parvati Shallow. And again, I am also excited to see Parvati here, and obviously with her being a traitor, that's a pretty interesting prospect. And so far, at least, I feel like she's been getting a pretty decent content with her setting up a rivalry with Sandra, with her wanting to become the queen of the traitors, And obviously, you have people like Dan talking about how she is a strong competitor and that she'd be perfect to be a traitor. So I feel like that's all pretty good. And I feel like moving forward, I think she's less likely to be targeted compared to Dan. Now, again, there are hesitations with her being higher in the list, with the big one being Sandra being onto her case and Sandra wanting to target her. And while I said that I think Parvati will win that battle, obviously that's far from being settled. And even if Parvati does win the battle, I'm still not sure if she'll get her way all the way to the end, where even Dan has talked about wanting to cut Parvati if it suits him. So again, there is some question marks there, but I feel like so far she's gotten pretty strong content considering she is a traitor and considering the way that she's playing the game right now. So because of that, she is here at number 6. Now moving on to number 5, and we are going back to a relatively smaller name, and that person is Deontay. And I feel like Deontay's gotten some solid content where he got an introduction in the premiere talking about being a boxer. And while his episode 2 was pretty quiet, we did see him taking more of a charge in episode 3, working alongside Sandra to target Max. And while he gets his way with the actual vote, obviously he does end up feeling pretty bad about it, which is something at least. But even so, I still have some question marks over where he truly stands within the game. Where while he was shown working alongside Dan, he was also considered a potential murder target during the Marcus round, which isn't great. And I could still see some people like feeling like he has too much influence, which could put a target on his back. But compared to the other faithfuls we talked about, I feel like I have fewer qualms with Deontay's edit at this point, and I feel like I could see him making a deep run. But again, we'll have to see. But for now, I do have him here at number 5. Now moving on to number 4, and I did debate these next two. I wasn't entirely sure what to make of them, but at number 4, I did decide to go with Sheree. And I think Sheree's been getting some interesting content here, where in episode 2, her main storyline is her not believing Trishelle and not thinking Peppermint is a traitor. And while she does vote for Peppermint by the end of it, she does get a chance to explain this vote, where she said that she was certain Peppermint was faithful, but changed her vote after hearing everyone, and that she felt bad for voting within the majority. And that is kind of followed up upon in episode 3, where she does vote for Janelle, again, kind of a stray vote in the grand scheme of things. And while objectively, voting against the majority here is probably not a good game move, especially this early on in the season, I feel like the show itself props it up as a positive for Sheree. That and also the fact that Sheree is technically right in thinking Peppermint is not a traitor. So again, I feel like those are pretty positive things and a big reason she is this high on the list. However, at the same time, there are a couple of question marks with Sheree's longevity in the game. I feel like for one, she has a very quiet premiere, and I feel like outside of her qualms with the Peppermint situation, she actually doesn't get that much content over this first week, which is a bit of a worrying sign for me. But I think the other thing is her relationship with Phaedra, which kind of came out of nowhere at the end of episode 3, where obviously Dan and Parvati were very much considering murdering Sheree at this latest round, and obviously they had to grapple with the fact of potentially upsetting Phaedra because it is. And while they don't go through with the plan, I feel like the fact that this relationship is only being set up now is probably not great in the grand scheme of things. And with her premiere and even her episode 3 being kind of quiet on Sheree's and herself, it does make me a little bit worried about her for that reason. But I feel like her storyline of her not going along with the majority could lead to something at least, which is a big reason she is at least as high. But I feel like there's enough holes with her edit to leave her here at number 4. Now moving on to number 3, and I did debate whether this person was too high. However, I feel like compared to the other people, I feel like there are fewer holes in this person's edit up to this point, but we actually have Larsa. Now, I think the one major negative with Larsa's edit is that she did immediately accuse Parvati of being a traitor due to Alan lifting his jacket next to her, which made her think that Alan had tapped Parvati's shoulder, which is obviously incorrect, and obviously this was before Parvati was recruited as a traitor, so I think that's probably not the best look in the world. But I feel like outside of that, she has gotten pretty solid content. Where right away, she sets up her relationship with Marcus in the premiere, talking about how they are coming to the game as a couple, but they are both here individually and that they want to win on their own. And obviously with Marcus being a pretty early boot, that does give her the opportunity to play her own game. Where in episode 3, she is the one wanting to get revenge for Marcus, and she is the first one to bring up the idea that a man was behind the murders of Marcus and Bananas. And obviously that leads to Dan being a potential target there. And yes, while she does fail to get Dan out, I feel like MJ has taken more of the heat for that, while Larsa has been getting a bit more of a consistent edit, which I find pretty good. Now again, I'm not saying Larsa's edit is perfect by any means, and I could see it going downhill in the future. But I feel like there is somewhat of a setup for a season-long story arc with her that kind of leaves her here at number 3. Now moving on to number 2, and for me, these two are the pretty clear frontrunners, one faithful and one traitor, and it's just a matter of ordering them. But number 2, we actually have someone who I had at number 1 until this cliffhanger, and that person is Burgee. And I feel like of the faithfuls, Burgee is the pretty clear frontrunner for me, where I feel like he's had a pretty perfect edit up to this point. Or right away in the premiere, he sets up this storyline of him like wanting to prove to people that he can't be manipulated, despite him coming off as someone who is a bad liar and someone who is pretty clumsy, and he wants to show people that he can figure things out on his own. And he gets a pretty nice check-in in episode 3 during the breakfast where he talks about how morality is important to him, but this game is about getting the upper hand, and that if he can find the right people, he can stay alive and be under the radar. And while he's not super active in the actual gameplay during this first week, I feel like it's a bit more intentional with Burgee, considering he has talked about wanting to be under the radar, and he hasn't been shown making a wrong read, despite him voting within the majority at each of the 2 rounds. So I feel like Burgee is someone who has gotten a lot of solid content, and a lot of unnecessary content as well, which is usually a good sign. Now the one thing holding me back from having him at number 1 is the fact that he is in the room with Parvati, and that there is a chance he could end up touching the chalice and me taking that right then and there, and if he does, I will look pretty stupid here. But I feel like based off the edit we've gotten from Burgee so far, I feel like he's gotten mostly solid content. He hasn't really been undermined the same way as other people, and I feel like he's gotten just enough content to where he's not being overexposed, but also not being neglected in the edit either. So I feel like out of the faithfuls, I have the most faith in Burgee right now to make it deep into the game, even though he could technically be murdered here. But for all those reasons, I do have him here at number 2. And now, at number 1, the person I believe is the most likely to win the Traitors Season 2 right now is Phaedra, the other traitor on the board. And again, I feel like Phaedra's been getting pretty solid content, all things considered, where first up, she does establish the fact that she hasn't played on these other shows like Survivor or Big Brother. We even had that scene of her going through the portraits with Kevin and talking about all the people from the other shows. And then after she becomes a traitor, she outlines her strategy of being under the radar and letting Dan and Parvati make all these decisions. But at the same time, she's someone who is very capable of keeping secrets and someone who is capable of navigating through the game despite her lack of experience. And kind of similar to Burgee, I feel like this under the radar approach to the game is being presented as a very intentional strategy on Phaedra's end and something that will probably help her in the game. But even beyond that, she gets some solid personal content where she ends up consoling Deontay after Max is taken out. I feel like of the 3 traitors, Phaedra's edit has probably stood out to me the most. Where yes, while she isn't a Survivor or Big Brother player like Dan or Parvati are, I feel like Phaedra is still like being taken seriously within the edit. And I feel like she's someone who has a storyline of potentially growing as the game goes along, allowing Dan and Parvati to make these bigger moves in a way that could eventually result in Dan and Parvati being targeted, where we're already seeing Dan being talked about as a potential target. We obviously know that Parvati is someone that Sandra is onto. And I feel like Phaedra is just kind of there. No one's suspecting Phaedra right now of being a traitor. And I feel like she's someone that can really take advantage of the situation she's given right now to where she will eventually allow Dan and Parvati to take all the bullets there while no one suspects her. And I feel like with her getting this other content along the way, I feel like she'll eventually grow to become a better player. Now, yes, it's only the first week, and it's very possible she could be undercut in the future, but I feel like of the traitors, I feel like she's the one I had the most confidence in to outlast the other 2. And while I could see Burgee overtaking her in the future, there's the obvious fact that Burgee could be murdered at the beginning of next episode, or potentially have a drop-off in his content. But I feel like with the content Phaedra's gotten so far, I feel like she's the one that I probably have the most confidence in right now to actually win the game. So because of that, I do have her here at number 1. And there we go. That will do it for this week's video. If you liked this content, be sure to like and subscribe. Really helps with the channel. Now I'll be back again next week to update the power rankings again, so you can stay tuned for that. I am making other general content during the off season, but I will also be covering Australian Survivor when that comes out in a couple weeks, so you can look forward to that. I'm on Patreon, so if you want to consider supporting the channel, you can do so by clicking the link in the description, and you can also join the Discord server by also clicking the link in the description. There's a lot of stuff coming your way, but for now, that is the video. See ya.